Okay, thank you very much to everybody joining us this afternoon. Basically, we have put on an event that's basically quite underreported. For this conversation, we wanted to provide a safe space, or as our guest speaker, Nicole, has rightly put it, a brave space for how best we as a community can tackle domestic, sexual, and other forms of violence against Black women. We understand that what we'll discuss can be triggering. So for anybody in attendance, if at any point you feel that you wish to leave the meeting or feel the conversation becomes a bit too heavy, please do feel free to leave at any stage, or basically do what is right and what makes you feel safe. That's completely understandable and 100% something that we are aware of. Basically, it's part of the discourse that we wanted to be able to facilitate a community discussion on addressing male violence, also known as, or violence against women and girls, specifically looking at the impacts of this towards Black women because it's so heavily underreported. We wanted to look at rooting out the causes of this violence from within our community and are solely wishing to provide a platform to facilitate this discussion by listening to those who are affected and directly impacted by said violence. We do understand that domestic violence does affect males, but our focus for this conversation will be around the impacts of domestic and sexual violence towards Black women. Just some minor housekeeping rules. If you happen to have any questions, please do use the raise your hand function, which I'm just going to demonstrate just now. With me. So there we go. So if you happen to have any questions, please do use the raise your hand function. And we'll basically take questions after both of our speakers have presented. Please note again that we do record our meetings, so if you do not wish to be captured on camera, please do feel free to turn off your cameras. We want everybody to feel comfortable being here with us, so please do feel free to remain off camera if this is your preference, and particularly so if you're wanting to ask a question during our Q&A. And lastly, we just kindly ask that all participants keep their microphones muted while speakers are presenting. And we'd like to encourage active participation through the chat function, as well as through the raise your hand function, specifically during the Q&A function. If anyone wishes to ask a question anonymously, please do direct it to one of the co-hosts and we can ask without revealing your name. We will also be running some anonymous polls during the meeting, just to let you know that none of the information that we ask for is going to identify you in any which way. These are completely anonymous polls. It's just so that we can get a greater understanding as to the impetus as to why people are attending today's meeting. So thank you very much for joining us. I'm just going to hand over to our CLS President, Luke Daniels, who will just give us a quick update on some of the things that CLS have been working on with our comrades. Luke, over to you.
Great, thank you, Omar. Thanks everyone for joining. We will just do things a little bit differently at this meeting because we've decided to do our short reports at the beginning so that we can have a full discussion that, you know, at the end on domestic violence. And usually these discussions can run on a bit. So I thought we might get the short reports out of the way. We've usually got reports on Latin America from Dr. Francisco Dominguez, who's here. And I hope he will do a 5-minute or so report. I would just like to mention 2 events that I attended this week, because, you know, as I said earlier in some of our presentations, you know, we're an activist organization. We like to think we're out there taking action to try and bring about change. I attended the climate change demonstration in front of the Hackney Town Hall on Friday and spoke at a meeting offering solidarity from CLS. It was attended by lots of young children. They sang and they presented and they had the posters, and there were other speakers, and it was a really good meeting. And they were very pleased that Caribbean Labour Solidarity was there to actually highlight how climate change is affecting the Caribbean, which is what I actually did at the meeting. I also attended a demonstration in front of the Jamaica High Commission, which was organized, I think, by Zita Holborn and others, Black Lives Matter, other people were there. And that was maybe about 20 people attended that demonstration. You know, we chanted and spoke, and I gave message again of solidarity from Caribbean Neighbor Solidarity. So yeah, that's my report for now. And maybe we can ask Francisco if he's there. I don't see you on the screen. Ah, he's there, he's there. Maybe we can ask Francisco to do his report now. And I don't know if any other executive members of CLS might want to do a short report. But for now, Francisco, I hand over to you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Luke. I have to apologize to Nicole because there are elections in Nicaragua today, and there is a huge intoxicating amount of this, misinformation, fake news, and what have you, surrounding this election from the BBC, The Guardian, and everything else you can imagine in the world. So we are very busy trying to counteract that with very few resources. So as soon as I finish my report, I have to leave the meeting, but I certainly watch the video of the presentation because this issue is extremely important to what you're going to cover. So apologies for that. Now, there will be elections. There are right now taking elections in Nicaragua, and the National Assembly is going to be renewed. There's going to be elections for president, vice presidents, and a few governors in the country. Not everybody is going to be re-elected, certainly the president and so on. And Nicaragua has been subjected to a coup attempt, which was quite violent in 2018, orchestrated, organized, and funded by the United States in the typical fashion that they do. So today, after the FSLN was able to calm things down and restore normality and so on, the economy has gone back to a rate of growth of about 4 to 6%, which is quite normal in their case. New hospitals being built, education has been restored, unemployment is declined, all the good things that you can imagine a progressive government will do. Nevertheless, internationally, even sections of the European Union and certainly the United States have been very busy trying to sabotage the election. And unfortunately, there is a section of the left, it's a small section, but it's a section of the left in the Western world that shares the view put forward by the United States that the FSLN government in Nicaragua is a dictatorship, which is completely false. So what is important is this: the elections are taking place in a normal fashion. The number of safeguards that there are in the whole country, in every single polling station, are absolutely impeccable. Every single one of the parties that is participating in the elections, and there is one progressive party and there are 3 right-wing parties who are contesting the election, are entitled to actually have representatives at every single polling station, every single what they call place of voting within the polling station as they wish. And only once and if all those present officials, election officials from all the parties, after they count the vote, sign the document saying, yes, what we saw in the box confirms, what we actually have seen in terms of counting, only then the document is signed and is sent to the Central Office for Computerization and Aggregation in order to produce the results. So everything that has been said I repeat, in the BBC, The Guardian and so on is a complete lie. What we are expecting to happen is 2 things, and that's why I'm going to end with warning this. Number one, the FSLN is likely to win in the region of 60 to 70% again. And the reason is they've managed to restore all the gains of the population that were jeopardized and certainly rolled back during the period of violence and certainly by the pandemic. And in that sense, this is very good. For example, Nicaragua has benefited by the donation of 1.2 million vaccines against COVID-19 from Cuba. This is something only progressive governments do around this place. Nobody else does it. If you ask the UK government to give you vaccines, they won't even give them to anybody, not even their closest partners, let alone the United States. So it is extremely important to understand this. So they're going to win. So tomorrow, I think we should expect a huge amount of falsification, distorted news, fake news, lies, and so on from all the corporate media. So we need to be prepared for that. That's number one. And number two, we're not sure about this, but certainly is a possibility that sections of the right, encouraged by the United States, may not recognize the results. So therefore, these will allow the United States to do what they've done to Venezuela, not to recognize the results, despite the impeccability of the elections, and therefore to have a justification to launch all sorts of sanctions against Nicaragua. Already the United States Congress and the United States government have approved about 5 sets of sanctions against this little country in Central America. I finish with this. The GDP of Nicaragua is 14 billion, which is, incredibly minute compared to the United States, which is 23,000 billion. That gives you an idea of what the Nicaraguans are confronting with all the military power, all the economic power, all the media power, all the political influence the United States is able to wield. So it is quite important in this case, David wins against Goliath, and we have to be there to support it. So I'll finish with that because I know there is no time for that. Omar, if I can I put a link to a document that clarifies these misguided people who on the left who believe that the FZLA is a Thank you very much, and I'm sorry for
Absolutely.
No, thank you, Francisco.
Thank you very much, Francisco. Absolutely fine. So basically, we have been taking part in a lot of the climate action over the past 2 days. As you know, it's COP26 at the moment. So there's been a lot of discussion and protesting for better outcomes for smaller and developing states who are inclemently affected by climate change. So as part of our action and showing solidarity with all groups who are protesting at the moment, CLS have taken part in protests in Hackney, and also yesterday marching towards Trafalgar Square in wanting to provide better outcomes for our communities across the world. Luke, sorry, did you have something else?
No.
Absolutely. So essentially, we will now head over to our esteemed guest speaker, who I'm very, very, very pleased to be able to introduce, Nichole McGill Higgins, who is an award-winning campaigner, consultant, and a trustee of the Rape Crisis Centre, South London. Nicole, thank you very much for joining us, and over to you.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yes. Anyway, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for attending. And it's good to see that we've got some men in the audience, which is really, really important. So I'm just going to share my screen, so bear with me 1 second. And just give me a thumbs up that you can actually see the first slide. Yes, good, perfect. So without further ado, so I do have what we call a session agreement. And I think Omar kind of alluded to some of that already. So if we can use the chat, it's really, really important that if you do have any questions or if you see any slides or any stats that come up today, please kind of get involved and make some comments, have conversations around that. If you've got reports or you have information that's similar or complements what I'm saying, and challenge, of course, please use the chat so we can make it really interactive. This is a community conversation, and this has been put on so all voices are heard. Although myself and Luke will be delivering a presentation, it's really important that everyone has a voice and gets involved. And as Omar rightfully said, if there are any triggers or what have you, or you've got questions you want to ask, but you don't want your name to be visible, please just direct those questions to the host, and that can be asked on your behalf. So no question is a wrong question. This is a safe space stroke brave space. And brave space for me, the V in brave means vulnerability. And especially in topics like this, there's a huge amount of vulnerability that can be shown and is also needed to be brave. So for me, I'm quite exposed and vulnerable for me to step into that brave space. And I'm encouraging you, if you feel comfortable, to do the same. No naming. If you do have a conversation or you want to kind of let people know what's happening or what's happened, please don't name anyone, just in case the person here knows them or that person is in the room. Listen respectfully. We're all on a different journey. We're all in different places on the journey. So if we can listen respectfully, be non-judgmental, respect other people's opinions. And if there are any triggers, please walk away. Please switch off your cameras if you need to, continue to listen, do other stuff in the background. But if there are any triggers here, we do have resources that Omar will be sharing if people do need to go to those resources, or if you're somebody from a professional capacity, that will help as well. So that's on my session agreement. So I just want to say a little bit about me. So that's me when I was 4 years old with my mum, who is of Jamaican heritage. And that's kind of me now. Looks a bit different today, but that's kind of me now. And I'm not here in the capacity as a trustee from RASASC. I'm here basically, one, as a Black female, two, as a survivor, and to really speak to you from that. I wanted to be a trustee for RASASC for two reasons, really. When I was sexually assaulted, I went to RASASC and I went to other organizations which I felt did not understand my culture, did not understand me as a Black woman. So what I actually wanted to do is kind of have a voice. And I think it's important that we do have Black people and representation on boards. So 15 years later, the role came up and I decided I'm going to go for the role and I'm going to have some impact and have my voice in that room and try and have some influence. So that's the reason why I decided to be a part of the RASASC community. I was a trustee beforehand for the Croydon BME Forum, but I still have connections with the grassroots. I'm also a diversity and inclusion practitioner. I go into organizations and I speak about strategies around anti-racism. I really talk about belonging, but I do have a wider lens on anti-racism, especially after the horrific modern day lynching, as I call it, of George Floyd. And as we know, it's very, very prolific in the news. And we've known that racism has existed for centuries, not even decades. But it's very heightened at the moment. I was just going to say, Omar, I've got the poll up here, so I'm just going to close it. So that came up for some reason. I don't know if I activated it or not.
I'm sorry. One of the participants has asked, is it possible to increase the size of the screen?
Of my screen? What are you actually seeing? Are you seeing?
We're seeing the slide, but we're also seeing the entire screen with the
Are you seeing the other
file,
bits too?
home, etc.
Right.
Yes.
Thank you for whoever said that, because I've shared
just
the wrong
full
screen.
Presentation.
Apologies.
No, it's okay. No
Is that
problem.
better?
Yes, that's
there we go.
yes. Thank you. That's what they want.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's exactly what should have come up. Thank you for that, because I would have continued quite happily and not even known. So thank you. So that's just, so as I say, I'm a diversity and inclusion practitioner, but I talk about the wider lens on race, and I also talk about sexual violence against women and girls. And I'm going to be honest with everybody in the room today. When Omar asked me to do this, I ran a mile. I didn't want to come and speak because I haven't really spoken publicly, one, about my experience or around this. And sometimes you can feel like you're not equipped to talk about certain things. So this is really me stepping into my brave space, and also being on the board at RASASC. I'm also leading on the anti-racism strategy there. So I'm learning so much. So like I said, we're all on a journey. Yes, I do have lived experience. Yes, I am a Black female, and I understand what it's like to go through the justice system when something horrific happens to you. But just coming here and speaking to you all today, this is like a massive step for me. So thank you for having me. And I think honesty is key. So this is a quote that I really love. And it just basically says, if I am not free while any woman is unfree, even when her shackles are very different from my own. And it shouldn't have to happen to you to matter to you. And I'm going to go through the different kind of aspects of sexual violence against women and girls. And some people may have experienced more than one. But what I mean is that we need to work together to just stop sexual violence against women and girls, full stop. So that's quite a powerful quote for me. So most of the data that I've got on my slides today has been taken from this fantastic snapshot report. And in this report, Omar will have the resources. It's in the resources list when we share that. And I would encourage anyone who is in this space or wants to learn more to look at this report if you haven't already. There's lots of links in literally every single page. It refers to a link that gives you more reports, more information. So, but most of my slide in terms of content around statistics is based on this report today. And I just wanted to share that with you. But like I say, we do have those resources to share at the end. And I would encourage anybody to have a look at them. They are harrowing statistics. There's also solutions and things that we should be doing better. There's some yawning moments, like to say, been there, done that, nothing's changed. But I think it's good to know what reports are saying, especially from 20 to 2021, and we're not looking at old data. So just to have a look at what is violence against women and girls and what kind of sits underneath that. And when I first came into this space, I literally thought it was just rape and domestic violence. When I see that all of these under here is included in that, so we're looking at sexual harassment, sexual exploitation and trafficking. And I don't think transgender is under there as yet, because as we know, this is a very feminist space and there's lots of conversations around that. However, all of these are underneath violence against women and girls. And the reason why there's a circle here is the so-called honor crimes. There's kind of different attachments to that. So not agreeing to marriage, divorce, wear clothes that are not approved of. So there's a whole catalogue of things that come under each one of these. So when you look at the complexity of the Vogue sector, there's a lot going on there, and it's quite worrying when you think all of these things are there, including, I think they've now added online violence and kind of that emotional torment. So the next few slides are really going to be around recent trends, and I will be reading off the slides but talking about them. And please put anything in the chat if you wish, and ask any questions, and Omar will pull them out later on. So when we had lockdown, so we know that there was an increase around COVID, and those figures were like 80% increase, which is absolutely like crazy, right? Like there was 40,000 more calls to the National Domestic Abuse Helpline when the first COVID, in the first 3 months. So imagine we've been in a pandemic for 18 months. So if this happened in the first 3 months, you can imagine the impact that it's having on women and girls who are living with their abusers and who are being repeatedly and systemically abused. When we look at this, so Respect runs a helpline for perpetrators who are worried about their behaviour, and they reported in the first month of lockdown alone saw an increase of 67% by calls, emails 185, web chats 2,200%, and visits to the website was 581 from the start of lockdown. So again, if you look at and think of the amount of people that's probably included in that, that gives you a really good bird's eye view that this is almost, it's horrific. It's something that we have to be aware of, the figures. And I think when you see figures as well and you see stats, it really sinks in. Data is really, really important. And I know as a community, we don't like to give data, and we don't like to, we ask questions on forms, and we don't think that it's anything that's going to be beneficial to us. But at least when we see these stats, we can then say, this is what's happening. And this is also a problem in the Vogue sector, to be fair, is that it's not being monitored around how many women of color or Black women are being raped, or any reports around their whole experience around the system. So other recent trends, so this is 2019 to 2020, as opposed to 2021. So these are the amount of rapes that was actually reported, and we all know that that's probably a triple figure of who's not reported. If you look at how many was prosecuted, just over 2,000, and then just under 1,500 came with conviction. And this is again from that report, End Violence Against Women. So again, when you look at those stats, when you look at 55,000 reports of rape, and that's the amount of convictions. And I will be looking at an infographic later on that kind of really does dissect what the whole experience is with the justice system. Data also shows in hospitals who treated like just over 1,000 female assault victims, stroke survivors in the year of 2019 to 2020. And this was due to maltreatment, including sexual or physical abuse, torture, or mental cruelty. This has increased by 31% since 2015 to 2016. So again, we're seeing massive increases in violence against women and girls. And I think, again, that's almost a staggering statistic. So this is the infographic that I wanted to talk to you about, and I'm going to really concentrate over here. So this is almost like what really happens at every stage of the criminal justice system. And I actually experienced some of this myself because I reported my perpetrator, or the perpetrator, as his language has been teaching me to say. So when you think 2 in 10 women have been raped, reported to the police, so that's 2 in every 10 women that's been raped. Only 3% of these cases see the suspect charged. 42% of trials would result in guilty verdicts, and 58% are acquittals. So when you go to the other side now, why aren't we reporting it? Why are we not talking about it? It's because of the fear of the perpetrator, fear of not being believed, more urgent basic survival needs. You just don't want to think about it. And as a survivor, it didn't happen. You start thinking, well, maybe if I did this, or maybe it didn't really happen, or did I say this, or did I say that? You almost start to gaslight yourself. And then you don't want to go through the humiliation, because I'll talk about racism in a second. But when we talk about the trauma of any form of violence against a woman, and then to go and report it and go through that trauma again. And what really jumped out at me is number 2, because I remember this happening to me and I just couldn't comprehend it. When anything happens to you in terms of you've been raped, when you report it, you're seen as the witness, not the victim. And I couldn't understand that phenomenon. How am I the witness? It happened to me. So that has already taken away my power, because now the perpetrator can get the best lawyer in the land, can basically dig up anything they want around me, but I'm the witness and I'm going to be cross-examined. Nobody wants to go through that when you have been through anything that is as traumatic as violence against you. Then when you look at number 3, so what actually happens in court, again, the cross-examination, you don't want to relive that. You're going to relive it anyway, but to do it publicly is awful. And then what we look at the aftermath, the consequences, the flashbacks, the anxiety, the difficulty in trusting people. You don't want to go out when it's dark. There's a whole catalogue of trauma that comes with that. So this is really around the system, what happens in the criminal process, the criminal justice process. CPS, criminal justice, is they're actually trying to change this at the moment. So they have got a report that I've shared with Omar as well, so that will be in the resources. And it's kind of like a robust strategy looking at what can we do differently. Now, people who've been in this space for a long time are very skeptical about this, because we've been saying it for ages. It's just like racism. We've been saying it for decades, for centuries. We know this exists and it has to be done better. The fact that the CPS is the ones that make the decisions around what goes to court and what doesn't, the power is taken away from us. We don't even have any say in what happens. So the CPS, they do have a report. And as I say, Omar does have the link to that, which he will share. It does look hopeful. They have brought outside people in, because I always say that if you're making decisions for a group of people, you need to have those voices in the room. And it looks like that's the strategy that they have gone for. So let's see what actually happens with that. So racial trauma is real. So you have a lot of trauma around violence against women and girls. And then it's doubled up with the racism for women of color and for Black women especially. We know that we're sexualized. And then we've got the outside external factors, and then we've got the internal factors of our heritage, what we're not meant to talk about, what's brushed under the carpet, what's not then believed. So all of this is just completely dismantling any form of power, of feeling of, I haven't made, it's not my fault. So let's have a look at racism and some of the stats around that. So recent trends show that 50% of Black and minoritized women, especially as refugees, the refuges have actually been forced to close. So what we're finding is that if you're an organization of color, you're not getting the funding. We're just not getting the funding, and we know this. So we're hoping that people in the community will donate. We rely a lot on volunteers, but as you know, you need money for things to happen, right? So they've either been taken over by larger organizations, and many are continuing to operate at grassroots levels, but with no government support whatsoever. So what you're finding that they may register as a CIC, but they still need a larger organization to get that funding. And we've seen a lot of that happening. So these are very UK or London centric stats. And I understand that this organization does deal with people outside of the UK, but what I'm presenting today is very UK driven, but I'm sure we will see parallels in other countries. And it would be interesting that if anybody is in the room from another country, if they could put something in the chat around what the stats are in their country, or any information that they may have, or any links that they may have that kind of parallels what I'm saying now. But one of the main issues is that if we are a Black-led organization, we do not get the same support. And that goes back to when we talk about white privilege, stroke advantage, stroke systemic and institutional racism. It's all wrapped in this. So other trends is around more than almost half of the women that struggled to find a refuge space last year, identified by Women's Aid and Turn Away projects, were from Black or minoritized backgrounds. So that's women who are trying to do better, trying to seek help, and more than half were women of color or from minoritized backgrounds. And when you look at the inequalities that are faced by us as Black women, and especially if you're from an immigrant background and English isn't your first language, it is almost near impossible to get that support and that help. And that does go back to institutionalized racism and systemic racism. So the report basically examines the cultural framings, and that's when we need to kind of turn the magnifying glass and look at what are we doing culturally? What cultural habits are continuing to thrive that's stopping us from stopping this violence against our women and our girls? So I'll go on from that slide. I'll be sharing the slides with Omar afterwards for anyone anyway. I haven't put any links because all of my resources I've sent to Omar to create a resource kind of fact sheet for all of you anyway, so there's no links necessarily in this. I found this, I wanted to put this infographic in because I found this to be quite well, all of the stats kind of blew me away. So these are comparative levels of rape in ethnic groups. So mixed race women, 3.4, Black women, 1.6, and white women, 0.8. And if you were to put the two together, because as we know, mixed race women do identify as Black, then you can see what is higher. And I think even by splitting it as well, there's something there to even make it maybe look less than what it really is. Because I always say that when we talk about different races, and we've got this long list of your Black Caribbean, Black African, when these lists were invented, it was if you are not white, you are Black. That was basically when they were looking at the government statistics. So if you're not white, you're Black. Now we do have the splits between if you're Indian British, if you're Black British, etc., etc. But many mixed race women do identify as Black. So if you were to put the two together, you would see that it's even a bigger percentage, obviously. So what we're also finding that in this space, we don't have any representation. And we know that representation counts. I've had counselling and none of them was of Black women, and I ended up not going back because I didn't feel like I was being understood. I felt that this cultural and racist stereotypes was very much in the counselling session with me, and the trust wasn't built. It's not that you can't go to people who are not from your heritage, because I know quite a few of my friends who have gone to people who are not Black and they've had phenomenal counsellors. So I would never discredit a counsellor, but representation does matter, and it's about options, right? So if I was to have a choice of having every type of woman in front of me, then I've got that option. If there's only an option of a particular group of women that could counsel me, then that's been taken away. So the report also shows that it's good to see people that look like you and could potentially understand and speak your language. So without community, there is no liberation. And I think we've all probably heard it takes a village to raise a child, and it takes a community to understand the disparities which are happening and what's going on in our community around violence against women and girls. And I know that I've spoken quite a bit around sexual violence, but in that kind of third slide, it showed all the kind of violence against women and girls which exists. And you know, we do talk about FGM and other violence against child abuse, trafficking. So all of that's in there, of course. So again, I'm not discounting any of those. So if we look at what are the challenges of women of color, so domestic abuse is harmful and practices are taboo issues and need to be tackled. Because you know, I've heard people say to me, Nick, I've seen people come into work on a Monday and you just know what's happened over the weekend because they've tried to cover up maybe a black eye or what have you. And it's very taboo. It's not spoken about and it's denied for many, many reasons. There's many layers to this. And today's just 2 hours and I think I've got like 20, 25 minutes, what have you, to speak about this. So it's almost like a whistle stop blow. So this is why it's important that we do have that interactive conversation. The other things that are challenging for women of color are services are not providing culturally sensitive services. When you're not understanding the culture and the heritage of somebody, how can you serve them correctly? People are not being trained in this area to understand what the cultural differences are, because there are cultural differences. And we know that even as Black people, we know that my heritage is Jamaican. I went to school in Jamaica. But then if I speak to somebody from Barbados, there's similarities, of course. We're from the Caribbean. If I speak to somebody from Kenya, if I speak to somebody from, from somewhere else, there are cultural differences and they need to be understood. The appropriate language translation in services. So if you've got somebody who's ringing a helpline, but nobody speaks the language, you're not helping that person. So these are some challenges: lack of awareness of domestic abuse and harmful practices from professionals. And that's around training and understanding of cultural awareness again, lack of trust and negative experience from services in our communities. And I can definitely that resonates with me, because that happened to me. I didn't feel like that I had a lack of trust, because I didn't feel that I was being understood, and I thought that was a lot to do with me being a Black female, and lack of services offering cultural sensitive services and advocacy. So these are some of the challenges that we could potentially tackle and look at. And there's an organization called IMCAN that has the anti-racism charter for the Vogue sector. And again, if no one hasn't heard of it, or if you want to know more, go to their website. It does need to be signed. It does need to be advocated and pushed by us as a Black community, because it's something that is saying the charity is a very white industry anyway, just like many industries. And you've got that whole Guinness effect, but we don't even have the Guinness effect in the charities in this space, where you don't even have Black people throughout. It's very far and few between, and there isn't any impact, any influence, or any power in those rooms. So we need to change that. So we have many challenges, but here's just a few of them that I've just listed here. So there's a lady that works in, I live in Croydon basically, and Lioness Tamara, she's a Jamaican lady, and basically is a survivor of probably quite a few that's on that list, unfortunately. And what she does is that she offers like a 12-week program to develop survivors. It's not just the mental side of things, it's the financial things that happen. When you have any violence against you, it completely cripples you. It completely takes your personality. You're almost an empty shell. So you could lose your job, then you're going to lose your house, then you're not going to have your friends around you, then you're not going to have family around you. So what Tamar does is that she has like a 12-week program, and you can just read this. Again, I'll be sharing it, but it's to say that women in the community are doing stuff. Women in the community are trying to make a difference. And what we need to do is find who these people are, who's got these little organizations like Tamar has, and bring us together, because we will be stronger together. And I just wanted to really shout her out, because it was because of Tamar why I was even able to say that I'm a survivor, because I was in denial for probably 14 years. Even though I'd reported it, it's something that I couldn't come to terms with, so saying it publicly. So I know the power that Tamar has and other women in our communities. And it would be good to know outside of London, so we're not so London centric, and then in turn outside of the UK. So it's a matter of bringing us together. So what are the tips that we could have around what can help women? What can help us? So it's not your fault. And I think that's probably the hardest thing, is not to blame yourself. If I didn't drink that, if I didn't go there, if I didn't send that text, if I didn't, we blame ourselves. It's not your fault. You are just not to blame. And there is help out there. And again, Omar has spent a lot of time putting some fantastic resources together to make sure that that help is there. And even if you do reach out to one of these organizations and they can't help, they should be able to signpost you to somewhere else. So we may not have covered everything, but we've tried to give a really comprehensive fact sheet for you. It's okay to talk about it. It is okay to talk about it. It's difficult. If I was to tell you what I have been through, even putting this presentation together, it has been absolutely shocking. It's been really triggering for me personally, for many, many reasons. And I've had to like ring my husband or ring my brother. I'm lucky, I've got a very supportive family. I know we all do not have that. So I'm very grateful, but it is okay to talk. And this is why it's good to look at the resources and who can you reach out to. Talking about it is the first step of getting help, because if we don't acknowledge that, then we can't move forward. Seek professional support. So speak to your GP, speak to your employer. Some people don't want to, it depends on what their employer's like. And there are support services out there, and there are Black-led organizations out there. Again, we do have a list to signpost you to them. Seek support to meet like-minded women who's gone through similar things, because you would be absolutely surprised how many women have actually been through some form of violence against them. I was speaking to my daughter-in-law yesterday, actually, because of this presentation. I was speaking to her about it because I had the grandchildren around, and she was saying to me, she's 27, and she said to me, Nick, I know double figures of my friends that have either been in abusive relationships or been raped, and they've never spoken about it, like reported it. And that's double figures, and she's 27, and she can say she knows double figures. So we have the conversation, even if it's just within our own circles. We have like girls' nights, like bi-monthly, and we just talk about womanly things. and things come out where women have said they've never said this before. So again, it's that talking, it's that dialogue. It's really, really important. Things will get worse before it gets better. Keep the faith, and there is light at the end of the tunnel. And that probably sounds really cliche, but it's actually true. Once you actually say it, and you actually start to talk about it, and you start to read more about it, it is going to trigger, but there is light at the end of that tunnel. So what I do want to talk about here is male allies and bystanders, because we've spoken about our community that we don't talk about things, but not all men are perpetrators. And yes, we do know a high percentage are, but not every man is. And if there's a man in the room, it is your responsibility to speak up. Just like how we talk about racism, stand up, speak up, be an ally. If you see it, call it out. It's exact same thing here. You will hear many survivors say, my family members knew, my friends knew, they knew who it was, they knew when it was happening. Nobody came to my defense, nobody protected me. So it's really, really important that men are in this space and men understand what their responsibility is also to stop violence against women and girls. So what I would say is that you are enough, you're more than enough, and it is very difficult to even comprehend that because of the trauma that we go through, because we're dealing with the trauma of being hurt, of being raped, of being beaten, of being humiliated, and then to go to the justice system as we've just looked at, there's almost a what's the point? Who's going to believe me and what are they going to do anyway? But it's important to have that self-worth. You are more than enough. And look in the mirror and genuinely say that. I used to say, why would I look in the mirror and say that to myself? It works. It's important that for you to understand that this is not your fault. All the kind of things that we've just spoken about, that you're more than enough. And what I would say, it's important to step into your power. Speak up, because you'll be amazed the amount of other people that will stand with you. I will, for one, and it's important that we stand together as a community. So thank you. If anybody wants to connect and ask me any questions on LinkedIn, I'm more than happy for you to connect to me, speak to me, educate me, let's learn together. But as a community, we need to do better. We really, really do. And my name's Nicole, and thank you.
Nicole, thank you so very much. Huge round of applause. Literally, we thank you so much for your bravery and for everything you do. We are completely with you in wanting to provide better outcomes for our community, and we thank you very much for all the information that you put together and you've presented for us on a topic that's extremely important. Bennett, sorry, you.
Just to say, I'm compiling the questions that come through for submission to the speakers, and comments that are anonymized or will also be passed on to the speakers.
Yeah, so you heard it here from Dennett. If you have any questions, comments, etc., please do address them to myself or Dennett. We will be, we can ask on your behalf anonymously. That, you know, your name does not have to be provided. That's absolutely not a problem. So after that fantastic and very eye-opening and educational presentation from Nicole, it's my pleasure to introduce CLS President Luke Daniels, who is very much, this is an understatement, an expert in the field of working with the perpetrators of domestic violence. So Luke will be presenting for us on basically tackling male violence towards women. Luke, thank you, and over to you.
Thank you. My screens. Okay, I've got sound. I guess you'll do share screen in a minute. I just wanted to say thanks to Nicole so much for being so open and honest and speaking our truth. I think that is very significant, the way you set the scene, as it were, for this meeting. And I know, you know, it took a lot out of you to get this together, and you did it really well. And it's a hard act to follow is all I would say. But it's really great. I've started work with perpetrators of domestic violence about 30 years ago. I see today in the Observer, some of you might get the Observer newspaper, they're talking of a new approach and new things, as though this is something new that is happening again. I need.
Oh, Luke, I think you're muted. 2 seconds. Let me get your sound back on. Yeah, Luke, your sound is still muted at the moment. We just need you to unmute. Apologies, everyone. Sometimes we have the joys of
Okay, there we go.
meeting.
I think that's on mute.
Yeah.
Okay, are we okay there now? But I need to get my screen.
Yes.
So I can do that now.
Yeah, absolutely. Fire away when you're
Okay,
ready.
good, great. Okay, as I was saying, I've worked with perpetrators for many years. So I just wanted to actually give a little short history about work with perpetrators, because it actually is quite a new phenomenon in terms of social history. It's maybe 50 years it's been going, started mainly in the United States. And I think a big input from Canada at one stage when there was a massacre of women university students in Montreal. I think it was 30 minutes shot down by a man. It clearly was a sexist and misogynist attack. And so the work started then. In England, I started work with the Everyman Center, which was just starting up at the time, a new project it was. And they wanted to get a Black man counseling. I'd only just recently been counseling, and people knew that I was a counselor, and somebody directed me to the Everyman. I joined them, and eventually, I think I actually did the first session working with perpetrators at that center. But certainly, I did the first group work sessions. As a result, a television company got interested in our work and approached us to film our work. I think everybody was in agreement with it, mainly because we were very underfunded. We weren't doing full day's work, a full week work, most of us. And we didn't have the resources to actually publicize our project very well. So we were actually struggling at the beginning to get men to come to our project, because it was self-referral. You know, men had to call us themselves. But in reality, lots of times, it was the women who were being subjected to the violence found out about the Everyman Center and then presented the information to the men and said, you know, go do something about it, or I'm out of here. So lots of the men actually came through that way. Some found out about it differently. And the work started in around 1990, and we became the biggest center for working with perpetrators. The television program was made. It was called Pulling the Punches. I think some of you know I've got a book by that name. Now, I've got a number of slides here, which I'm going to use in this presentation. And I'll go to the first slide here, which is about showing you the incidents of domestic violence. You know, this one says a woman killed on
Luke,
137 women. Sorry, can you see?
Luke, I think we just needed to share your screen.
Okay.
So far, so good. But yeah, we just need to see the visuals of everything you've put together.
I'm seeing it on my screen, so I don't know.
It should be the green arrow just towards the bottom, where you can see the participants list.
No, I don't see that arrow you mentioned. I'm sorry.
If not, and
I need to get out of this.
No, you'll need to keep the Zoom on. If not, if you're happy to present, you can talk us through the slides. That's not a problem.
Some of them are visuals and pictures. It'd be better if people could see them. So if we can do that, it would make things a lot easier for me.
Yeah.
And faster, because I don't want to spend a lot of time actually reading the.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let's see.
2 seconds. You should be able to share your screen.
Sorry to interrupt. It has to
I
be
can
made.
see you there. Share screen.
Yeah, no. We actually have enabled everybody to share their screen in the meeting. So
I think only.
if you're co-host or not, you're able to share regardless. Thank you, Dr. Liz. Okay, can
Hi, Liz. Okay, do I press share screen?
yes.
Okay, here we go.
Click the share screen button, and then you'll
There we
need to make
go.
sure you've got your presentation open.
Okay,
There we go.
Is that it?
Yep, the joys of technology. We're getting there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm learning. Not too late. Now, this says 137 women across the world are killed every single day. I mean, it's a war. It's for me, it's a hidden war that we don't hear much about. I had done a calculation, and at one time, it actually amounted to more women have been killed by domestic violence over the last 10 years than had been killed by COVID, which had run into millions at one point. If you do the maths and you look at this, you will see it's a really horrific problem. So it's a huge problem that society faces. It's one of the most endemic problems. It's been with us for many, many thousands of years, to tell the truth. It's only since recently we've been able to gather statistics and doing research, and Nicole mentioned about figures and facts, and it's important we have the data. And so the UN has actually made it compulsory for governments signed up to the charter that they actually collect data on violence to women. And so we've gotten better information as it goes. So we know country by country, there's some work that's been done. Not every country has been recording it, and sadly the poorest countries often find it most difficult to keep statistics, and so that we can actually know how much resources need to be put towards this problem. But it is a huge problem, and this is some of the. I'll bring up another screen. I'm not able to change. I'm clicking on. Oh, here we go. This is the reality of domestic violence. As you see from this headline, chopped off our hands, went unpunished. Often in the poorer countries, men can do these kind of vicious acts and just disappear into the background, and reappear again years after it's forgotten. And it's not pursued to the end. And I think one of the important things about domestic violence is that men must be held responsible. I think if it is shown that men can get away with these acts, it will only make it likely that it will keep recurring. So the laws are important, but they need to be enforced, and often they're not. I'll bring up another slide. This one looks at what's happened in Trinidad. And so we know this is a global problem, not only in the UK, but it's now looking at what's happening in Trinidad. Now, this one is Guyana, sorry, and the Demerara, where a 25-year-old mother of 3 was found dead in the wee hours of Tuesday. I think the outcome of this case was that the man had actually committed suicide afterwards. And at one time, the incidence of domestic violence in Guyana was being repeated, men killing their partners and then killing themselves, become quite recurrent. And I think, for some other islands as well. In Trinidad, we see here again, and usually they show vicious weapons. The manner of these killings are often very brutal. And that again, for me, brings up another issue when Nicole mentioned race as a factor in it. Whenever I spoke about domestic violence in the early days when the Remand Project was there, we had different meetings. One of the first questions I would get asked is, are Black men more violent than white men? And, that was a recurrent question. Usually my response is that there's nothing inherent in Black men that makes them more violent, but men become violent because of the kind of socialization they receive. And I also add that, when you consider that for Black men who've gone through the experience of being raised by parents and grandparents who experienced slavery and the abuse of slavery, and for who know about slavery, we know that it's been a very brutalizing experience. And that has had an effect on Black men, the way in which they were parented. And no, this is not about blaming parents, because I think, parents do the very best they can. And even in spite of the hardships that they had themselves and the beatings they had, most of us from the Caribbean, would have experienced beatings. And it's one of the things we tend to pass on in our relationships as a way of settling or fixing problems. We've learned to use violence. But I'll come back to that in a little while more. So I'll just flip down to another slide. Here we go. Right. The roots of violence against women. Now, I think in tackling this question, this issue, there's not enough effort is being put into finding out what are the causes of violence. And we don't hear much said about it. We saw the wheel just now that you showed, Nicole, and the different versions of it have been around for a very long time. And they tend to just skate over the issues. You hardly hear patriarchy being mentioned. And one of my deepest regrets really about the trend and the way in which the attempts at tackling domestic violence in the Western world, in England, is that very often they don't address the underlying root issue, which is patriarchy. Now, patriarchy, in its briefest way that I can put it, is really is the rule for the advantage of men. And as a result, women suffer quite a lot because of that. And it's been going on for a very long time, from history, from prehistory. But it has not always been so, because, from the research I've looked at, in prehistory times, when we were hunter-gatherers, as they put it, it was more a case of, equal but different. And women did not experience the levels of violence that we know that is happening in societies today. From the time societies were formed and became established, there were men actually set up those societies, set them up in a way that they were in control, and women were subordinated immediately. And the expectation was that men will actually enforce the rules. Men would be punished if they did not. I've mentioned some of it in my first book, that the veiling of women, that's how it actually started, is that, at the time in society when most, women, prostitution was a way of life, almost for a vast number of women. And the rulers at the time wanted to be able to identify women who were prostitutes as opposed to who were decent women. And so only the decent women could, could wear a veil. Now, if a prostitute wore a veil and a man knew about it and did not report, he would be punished, and very severely. Could even die from the punishment he may get. So we know that the society encouraged men to be violent to women, in terms of subordination. As a matter of fact, England, only 100 years ago, it was just over 100 years ago, it was legal for a man to beat his wife with a stick, providing it was not thicker than his thumb. And I think, and it's from that we hear about the rule of thumb in law, that it was okay. Society so far has depended on men's violence, and in many cases had encouraged men to be violent to women. And now that they've decided, now that it's, there's more enlightenment and we realize this is not okay, it needs to change. I think more resources need to be put into encouraging and teaching men and supporting men to stop the violence of women, instead of punishment, which is the route that I think the action is being taken in this country, in most Western countries. All we hear about are longer prison sentences, more prison sentences, newer offenses like the recent controlling behavior. And for me, controlling behavior is a part of domestic violence. I don't feel it needs a new legal definition to make another crime to punishment. What we need for men is for more places that men could actually get support and get help to stop the violence, like the Everyman Center. I'll talk about Everyman a little bit more later. So we look at patriarchy, for me, is the root cause of all the problems, and we live in patriarchal societies, and here it is a bit hidden, but it still operates. If we look at the way women are still paid less for the work that they do than men, despite legislation of 40 years ago. And the predictions are it will take another 100 years before they reach parity with men in terms of equal pay. Another big factor is socialization for violence. Men are socialized to be violent because society still depend on the men using violence. In times of war, who are expected to kill or be killed? And this is a role that men play. Now that socialization happens in all kinds of different ways. It's not only in the actual fighting of war, but also in terms of how boys are taught very early on. We're given knives and guns and tanks, things to encourage us in violence. The films we watch, the games we play, they will be there. They all add up to that socialization for violence. The other thing we will learn as boys is the sexism in society. We come into a society that's saturated with sexism. Women bodies used for selling cars, to dustbins, or to whatever, and usually sexualized, and men learn to be sexist. And it happens in the home, and it starts in the home and in schools and from peers. And so we pick up that sexism very early on. It's there to set, it's part of the society we live in. We often hear about power and control as one of the reasons for men's violence, but I say we need to look at power and control in a bigger way. The way in which governments actually exercise power can affect the way communities and societies are. And even right now, we're in a pandemic and just coming out of it and need resources to rebuilding communities. And the biggest part of the budget has gone towards, and we need to question the direction that our governments are taking us. So when governments are actually using violence, it does encourage violence in the society. Research I've looked at is that when a country is at war, there's more violence in that society. Women experience more violence as a result of governments actually going to war. We know that in war, women will actually suffer the most. It is still a big factor that women will get raped in times of war. And, in some countries where war has been endemic, they've been described as some of the worst places for women to be. I mentioned inequality in a sense already, because inequality is one of the big issues around domestic violence. Treat women as less, and they will be mistreated at times from men. So I think it's important that we have equality in terms of women. Now we look at the government, and this is a government advisor. This slide you're seeing, a government advisor. This is her attitude. The children, from where I come from on my background, children come into this world good. They get mistreated, they get taught about mistreatment, and most will get hit. For the perpetrators that I've worked with, most of them have been hit. And what I found in my work is that the ones who have been the most severely mistreated are the ones who will behave in the most violent ways. They will break the bones. They will use extreme acts of violence. So I think the way in which we regard children and look to them, because our idea is that children should be punished for being bad. And those are the advisors to the government. So you worry about where will they get our issues. Okay, I got another slide. This one again brings out the racism that Nicole talked about, document services and so on. You know, Black women are treated differently. The way in which we saw with the other case of the two sisters being killed, the police actually taking pictures and broadcasting those photographs around. So we know the racism within the force. We know that there is racism in terms of providing services. And we know, you know, there's many Black-led organizations or women's organizations that are struggling for resources to provide a service to Black women. And I agree entirely with Nicole that we need services where we can have people in front of us who we can identify with. And that's crucial. I think the good thing about the Everyman Center when we started, the men, you know, recognized that. This is why they determinedly went after making sure that they had Black counselors. I was lucky to be one of the first one to work. And yes, okay, I got to another slide. I can go on forever about that. At least 15 police officers killed women since 2009. In my first book, I'm pulling the punches. I mentioned statistics in there about, you know, police violence. You know, it is a fact that there's more incidents of domestic violence within the police force than in the community at large. And it doesn't surprise me. If you think about it, the men who get into the force are men who, you know, they got an issue with control. They want to control people. They using violence as they see as part of the work. So a lot of men who are actually predisposed to controlling are in the police forces. There's serious problems in there, and training needs to be happening. Some officers take advantage of women who are actually approaching services for help. But there's cases of those. So I'll probably come to one of those slides. I must apologize. I've got my slides a little bit confused up. You know, this technology is a bit fresh for me. So I'm just speaking to those that I put up at the moment. And this one here is, again, looking at the government. When a government minister like Rob confuses the meaning of misogyny, you know, well, how are they going to lead us out of the problems that we're dealing with? They haven't got a clue themselves. And for me, you know, it's a whole problem with the system. As a politician, and I sometimes have had to think about it in some ways. I enjoy the work I did with perpetrators. I think it's important work, crucial work. I'm writing about it more now than actually doing counseling, but I think we need to change the whole system. And so I put energy into looking into how we can have better societies. And I think capitalism, in some ways, cannot deliver the goods for change in society, whether it be the climate or whether it be oppression towards women, children, or anybody, because capitalism inherently depends on inequality. It depends on some being more powerful than others. And I think, you know, so I struggle with how much politics and how much work with domestic violence. And I feel that maybe I'm getting the balance right, and because there can be no change without the political change that needs to happen. And so we have to keep challenging society and challenging the systems we live with. Again, police officers killing women. We see that. Sorry, I'm going back to an old one. I'll move down a little bit and look at another one. Now, this is from the time the Everyman Center was running, we had opposition, serious opposition from some women's groups, from some quarters about our work. We were criticized, attacked. I was attacked many times on television, on radio, at public meetings. I've noticed also, we were not platformed, often more opposition to the work that we're doing, and sometimes some women saw us as traitors working with men, challenged our work. There was always opposition to it. None much, and we see the name at the bottom of this slide, Sandra Horde. She's been spreading false information, in my opinion, about men's work, always attacking men's work. And I think most of that is because of resources and going after resources. At the Everyman Center, we almost made agreement with women's groups that we wouldn't go after finance that they might be vying for to get money. So we had to find alternative ways of funding our organization. As a result, we struggled for finance, and eventually, the center closed. And we lost a lot of experienced counselors. We lost a lot of men who actually went through programs, who were prepared to had changed, who wanted to help develop. I advocate myself that there should be centers, more centers for working with perpetrators. Is the only way we can really deal with this situation. We see a new report coming out, new funding, and new ways of tackling domestic violence. Most of it going to be directed at media campaigns and so on. The actual work has to be done. There has to be centers, there has to be places where men can sit down and talk about their violence and be helped by men who've been trained to do this work. But there's very little support for that. She says it's the worst idea ever. This is a new campaign. Some of you might get the Observer today. If you haven't had it, Nicole, it's in this paper today. But this new campaign that the government is starting. And already, they're saying there's some money for men's work, for work with the perpetrators, providing it doesn't take away from the money that's going to women. I don't want to sound as though I'm against women's work. I think it's the most crucial thing in domestic violence, a safe place for women to escape to. In some way aids our work. We can then have the opportunity to work with a man whilst the woman is in a safe place. But there has to be a rebalancing of the resources. About 1% maybe of resources goes towards work with perpetrators. How are we ever going to change the situation? Men have got to be engaged, men have got to be involved. Most of the men that I've counseled, most of the work that I've done is about getting men to accept responsibility for the violence. When they accept that responsibility, it's not only about themselves personally, they're looking to see how they, as a matter of fact, in some of the group work that we do, men would come back and report to the group how they've intervened, how they've interrupted, how they've done things. And quite a few of them, after they finished the program, wanted to join our helpline, because we had a helpline for men who needed to talk to a man, and they were happy to be part of that. So no ending domestic violence without involving more work with perpetrators is what I would say to the government anytime or to anybody. Okay. Well, that headline speaks for itself. No need to happen. I'll go to another one. This, I put this one in because, people sometimes wonder, who does affect domestic violence affect? It affects all sections of the community, men of all ages, all races, all positions in society. I've counseled policemen, I've counseled solicitors, I've counseled priests. I've counseled all kinds in the work that I've done. All ages, men from in the 80s, young men in the teens. So domestic violence and all classes. So we know it's affecting the entire community. And Will Smith here is talking about the experience of his dad abusing his mother and how, he witnessed that and the feelings he had for his dad, still with him. We're deeply affected by these things. And unless we get counseling and support, it's there with us. Who else is affected? Now, this is, some of you might have seen this, a really sad case of this brilliant athlete who was killed by her husband. And, you know, this is in Africa, but we know people of all ages, all classes, all backgrounds, all things are being affected by it. A case, just to make the point that, well, it's not only men who are perpetrators. And I think one of the problems we have with domestic violence as well is that men get continually stereotyped as being violent. And this is what I fear about the new campaign that the government is planning, that it might probably do more harm than good in terms of if it's just stigmatizing men as being violent abusers. So they have to be very careful about how they work in that. They need to spend the money on running projects. Now, women as well are violent. In some societies, the incidence of domestic violence amongst women as perpetrators has been higher than that of men. A few countries are looked at in Latin America and in Africa. So we know it's a real issue. But as somebody rightly says, you know, show me the bodies, you know. And yes, most of domestic violence, the most brutal end of it is by men. And the vast majority, of course, is committed by men. But we must not ignore the violence that women do. When I was at the Everard, I'll show that screen now. This was the time of the Everyman Center when they showed Pulling the Punches. Now, it actually changed the whole direction of work with men. We were struggling at that point to actually get men into the project. When this was shown, we had 500 calls on the night, 500 calls. And our books were filled for years, really, because, you know, it was too much for us. We were working flat out. I remember counseling sometimes 7 men a day, which was just, you know, just crazy. And some women call as well. Some women call this, I need help. You know, I've been abusive to my husband. And so we know it can happen. Domestic violence, you know, women can perpetrate as well. Yeah, but today our focus is on men's violence. Okay, we did get some publicity. This was the, yeah, it is me. You might not recognize a mustache there. Omar, you might not recognize the face, but yes.
Very good, very youthful. Still look the same.
That was some time ago working with, during the time of the Everyman, the Independent, you know, gave us some publicity for work. And there's some journalists who, and Angela Phillips, who did that report, and she's still campaigning and still doing work on domestic violence. We need continuity like that. Now, at the Everyman, I devised my own program that I worked with, and this is roughly the group work program that I did. I did a session on men's liberation. But before I do that, I should say that, you know, one of the things, we did 3 months of individual work with the men so that we get to work with them to find out their personal history, stories, what has gone on for them, what is triggering the violence and so on. So we get to look at it. But also, you know, many of the survivors or the partners complain, they listen to them, you know, they talk with them. So we thought that it was really important. We also developed listening skills and with the men. So they all had to learn to listen to each other as part of the group work that I did with my men. And I think the other groups within the Everyman Center almost did the same thing. So in every session, they had to share, speak to the group, talk about the violence, be prepared to, as it were, counsel another man, listen to him, so on, and to talk about their violence. So that was important. Now, men's liberation seems like a tough title, and often women laugh at this one, yes. But men actually, men need liberation, but you know, it's not from women. Men are oppressed by the society. You know, I need to remind people that, you know, women don't oppress men. You know, we live in patriarchal some resources and run things as it were. But men are oppressed within that because of the roles that we're expected to play. One is we're expected to be providers, we're expected to be the ones who will also kill or be killed in times of war. We get told big boys don't cry, we get stopped from showing our feelings. As a result, we store up a lot of bad energy and so on, and end up doing hurtful things, prone to drug addictions and other things, drug overdose, suicides, most likely in prison, mental health system. We fill all those places. And yes, and we do hurtful things. So men need liberation. And for me, one of the ways in which we do that is by listening to the men, giving them a chance to talk about things that are stressful, hard for them, difficult areas, how we can help them. And we talk about that in the, I just do a, talk about it in the first session. They do exercises and so on. Women's liberation. Men are oppressive towards women. It's clearly that we've been the agents of oppression of women, and that's how society is forced into that situation, as I mentioned early on about patriarchy in the beginning of society. So in the very beginning, men were expected to be the ones to to oppress women. And so we were coerced into that role. And that's gone on for thousands of years. You don't overturn it, overnight. We need to be doing this work. We need safe places for men to be able to deal with these issues. I think the women's liberation movement has been able to advance in the way that it has done because there were these safe places for women. Many women's groups, many women's organizations and structures, so they can actually develop theory and practice. And I think the very same thing needs to be happening around men. In today's paper, I see in France, I think it is, they're looking to invest more in that and looking at toxic masculinity, as much as I hate that word, that they look at. Within the group, there was men of all classes. So I did a session on classism and class oppression, looking at the way in which, the whole society really is oppressive. And those issues, I think, in terms of raising awareness, was an important aspect to the work. I think when men have a sense of how they be used in society, how society is run, their role in it and so on, they can make those deep changes that are necessary. We had mixed race classes, so we had to do something on racism. So I did stuff on racism and also internalized racism because we've got some issues and problems here as well. Giving up addictions, a few of the men were, use alcohol or drugs. We had to look at those issues. Not to say that it's an excuse for it, because I think often it was used as an excuse, as an enabler, rather than the addiction itself, rather than the alcohol doing it, it was usually used as an enabler. So they had to look at ways in which they can change that. And parenting for change was so crucial because for those men that had to, relive their childhood and see where it is about going wrong. And when men actually realize they can do it exactly like my dad, they can start to make those changes. Many of them some were suicidal about their woman leaving them. And so we looked at relationships and building loving relationships, love class. You can't talk about loving a woman when you're abusing her. So we need to examine and look at that. So we had time looking at that. Goal setting, so they can think about what the goals they might want for themselves, their family, and so on. And then we did endings after we spent 6 months together of feelings for each other, and so on. Okay, I'm breezing through this quickly because I'm conscious of time. Now, some of the reasons for me with violence against women, Keith, almost all of the men I worked with were being hit as children, almost all of them. I had one man come to me in the time that I'd been working at the center who would not be hit as a child. But his way of being punished was to be sent to a room and I think left there for too long on his own, isolated. He learned to hit himself. And so whenever he was upset, he would take out, he would punch himself, hit his head against the wall, that kind of stuff. But for almost all of the men that I worked with, all had been hit as children. The ones who had been brutalized as children were the most horrific abusers. So, I think that's very sexist attitudes. They all they felt they should be in charge of women, in charge of livelihood. They were told because of the socialization for violence they received, they just resort to what they've learned. So yeah, that was some key things.
Luke, thank
Okay.
you very much.
Okay, is that time there? Should I do one more slide?
Yeah,
and then we
absolutely. We've
start?
got time for one more,
Yeah,
but I just want to say thank you very much so far. Just in time, just so we've got time for the Q&A. But please go ahead and
yeah, let me run this through very quickly.
Absolutely.
Now, again, in the government, when the child safety chief is, as I'm not sure that whether children should be hit or not, we got really rare problems. Children are not going to be protected. We look at the images we see about men. Boxing is one of the most damaging sports for men in terms of socialization. It's the highest paid sport, the most rewarded, the most highest accolades being paid to boxers. You get to see it free on television and everything. And all it does is actually stereotype men as violent and portray. Now, some research I looked at is somebody did some research about race in terms of boxing, and that for men, if a black man is beaten on the night of a big heavyweight fight, more black men die in the streets next day. If a white man is beaten, more white men die in the streets next day. So damaging. All right, here's Barbara Castle. I thought the paper read something useful. Barbara Castle, who campaigned for equal rights for women and for Equal Pay Act. Amazing. London has more statues of animals than named women. The sexism runs so deep in the society, it would take years and years to change. The effects of the socialization here, how does a 14-year-old behave so violently? We hear stories about the video games and stuff that those children play now, which desensitizes them for violence at a young age. Some of them binge on these acts, and on these games, they play it all night sometimes. I was involved with a Gulbenkian Foundation, looking into the causes of the James Bulger murder, and one of the things that really played out was that these young boys who killed were actually very addicted to violent video games. Okay. This one, that's my first book. That's what it's looked like. Pulling the Punches. It's available at Google Overture. I think they've got a website. Also at New Bacon Books and Hoosman's. And you can actually get it on the Caribbean Labor Solidarity website, I think. And my second book was Defeating Domestic Violence in the Americas. And in this one, Nicole, I heard you mention about, statistics and research and stuff from the Caribbean. There's a lot of it in this book because I've covered all the islands and all of Latin America. The Latin Americans especially like the book. It's been translated into Spanish. And one government is interested in becoming to train men to help set up centers and to further that work with perpetrators. So on that note, I shall end there. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you very much. Thank you very, very much for presenting on, again, another area that we don't hear so much about in terms of working with perpetrators of domestic violence to end the repeat cycle that we are currently faced with. Extremely, extremely grateful for you bringing your very in-depth experience to the table. And thank you for presenting. And as Luke said, he's the author of 2 books on domestic violence. I've posted links in the chat. You can pick up the most recently authored book, Defeating Domestic Violence in the Americas, Men's Work from Hansen Publications, who are a UK-based Caribbean publisher. Now on to our question and answer.
Before you do, yes, Luke, could you go to the top of your screen?
Yes.
And close your share, because you're
all right. New share. Okay. Yes. Okay.
Thank you.
Good.
Omar, if I can.
Oh, sorry, that didn't close it.
That's fine, Dana. If I can end the screen sharing, but
okay. If you can end screen sharing,
yes,
I'm new to this. If I can inform the audience.
Yes,
The
absolutely.
questions and comments have been shared directly with our excellent speakers. So they've got a copy of the questions on their email. And if we start with Nicole, with the questions that were directed to her. Nicole, you and Luke may want to read out the questions as they come to you. Back to you, Omar. Sorry to interfere.
Yeah, no problem at all. But yeah, if anybody has any questions that we haven't already shared with our panel, please feel free to raise your hand. Dennett has basically put together a list of the questions. So Dennett, if you'd like to read out the questions, that's absolutely fine by me. Please do fire away.
Yes.
Nicole, do you want to read out the questions, or shall I read them out?
It's easier if you do, because it just means I'd have to keep flicking from screen to screen.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. The questions to Nicole are as follows. These are from Michaela. Michaela says in her comment that there is absolutely a lack of disaggregated data, and it's a significant concern and invalidates the experience of Black women and children. In another question, she says to Luke, very informative, Luke, and highlights the importance of culturally informed interventions when working with perpetrators. But we need to acknowledge the racial trauma and the legacy of slavery, because this trauma has become intergenerational and perpetrated. Then there is a comment, an anonymous comment, who the commentator says, I can advocate for all peace everywhere with unity. I hope that commentator clarifies what they mean. Then Dr. Liz Okonkon circulated the information about the meeting today, and that is followed by a comment. What Nicole is highlighting is so deep, it takes Black women 17 times to get help and support that they need to leave a domestically abusive relationship, in comparison to 11 times for a white woman. There are such disparities in provisions. There is so much to challenge and dismantle. Robin Paris, greetings to Operation Safe Space from Barbados. We're an NGA run by survivors, for survivors. A whole management team is here and we're enjoying the session. And James Bowler, as he was leaving, said, hi everyone, I have to leave, but wanted to thank you for a very enlightening session and would love to help in any way. And James has given his email, which is in the chat. So that is the questions for you, and one for Luke. I've got other questions for Luke at the appropriate time. Oh, beg your pardon. There's one question here for the panel. It's an anonymous question. My question is about sexualizing and being shameless to our own sexual awareness. For example, carnival behavior being frowned on, where we have changed that narrative without authors to be proud of our bodies. Black women seen as nun, mum, or Jezebel. Should we change our behavior in any particular way? Thank you.
If I could get to the panel, is that to me? Can I answer that one?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, yes. Can I look, because as a fan of carnival, and I've played carnival in this country almost every time it's been on over the last 20 years or more. I think it's so important that we reclaim that space and that pride in our body and show ourselves. And I think, we need to remember that one of the reasons these carnivals took place was because coming out of slavery, the way we've been dehumanized and made to feel inhuman and feel ugly and feel terrible. And just having that joy to celebrate life and celebrate ourselves and body, I think is something we need to keep reclaiming that space and keep enjoying that moment of being able to be authentic in how we present ourselves and just have joy.
Yeah, and I think what I would say to kind of reiterate that is that's a part of our culture. The culture isn't the problem of the music or the way we dance. It's how our children are being raised and how they see that politeness. I used to go to a party and men would ask me to dance. not just touch me and stand behind me and start whining. You know, it's around that culture and that kind of consent. To me, there's a lot around consent and what that actually means. So no, I don't think that we should stop our culture or we should dismantle it anyway or we should dilute it. But I still think that because of the way the world is, there's maybe a bigger education piece around what that actually means or what that looks like. Because like you so rightfully said, we look at body shaming. I mean, I still find it very difficult because with our history, we know about Farah Bathwaite, who was in France and she was paraded through the streets because she had a big bottom. And she was sexualized, and they had, and this, sorry, I don't know how else to say this, but they literally just removed her private parts out of the museum in France because they didn't understand how she was shaped in that way because they stole her from Africa, basically. I'll try and find it and put it in the chat. And I've got that shape. When I look at that part of my history, I think I'm shaped just like this woman who was shamed. And, you know, and I was felt to feel like, you know, because I'm curvy, I shouldn't look this way or I should try and be slimmer. So, you know, but now you've got people having Brazilian butt lifts and doing their lips and, you know, getting bigger, this, that, and the other, and immolating the Black woman's figure, although we've been sexualized and demonized for so long. So no, we have to reclaim our power, but we also have to have the education piece in there. So our young men and our women know that there are boundaries and barriers. And that's what I think what has been blurred, not our culture and our heritage.
Thank you very much for that answer, Nicole. It's definitely still a problem to do with physiology and a racist perception that we're still dealing with. Luke, over to you if you wanted to provide comments. You had something rolling off the tip of your tongue.
No, I think that was enough said there by Nicole. She covered that. Was there a new question?
There is.
I thought I'd responded with the carnival bit and then Nicole bit. So yeah, I was finished there. Thanks.
Nicole, there's the question on the disaggregation of the data.
Yeah, tell me that again, please. Sorry.
There is a lack of disaggregated data, and it's a significant concern and invalidates the experience of Black women and children.
Yeah, so I'm gonna, and absolutely, and what we're finding, it's the trust factor though, isn't it? They're not collecting the data and it's clearly being stated. So I'm gonna put a link in the chat at the moment where I got most of my information from. I know Omar's got that on the resource page, but you may not know which one it is. And there is a really good, what do you call it, report around why we don't speak up, why the data is not being collected. So at the moment, there's a massive disparity. So if we've got the little bit of data that we do have, what does the real picture look like? And again, when it goes back to turning the spotlight back onto our community, can we do differently to move the agenda along? How do we say, yes, we will speak up? Does that mean that we have to have more Black-owned businesses where people do feel better? Does it matter? Is it a matter of collaborating? What do we need to do? And I think it'd be really good if people who are still here, if they could put in the chat, what do you think we can do as a community? We've been given lots of different facts today by myself and Luke. So we've kind of highlighted, okay, so this is the problem, but I like to see myself as a solutions chick. What ideas can we do differently? And how do we, if everyone does a little, no one has to do a lot. So what little can we do to make the difference? So we can see all the disparities, we can see all the percentages of what's going on, but what do we do differently? And what are the ideas around what can we do differently? So I'd be interested to see from the audience, what do you think we can do, or what are you doing? Talk about stuff that you are doing and what's working. But it's a really good point, but it's because the data's not being collected, partly because it's just not, because systems and what have you, and partly because we don't want to give it because we're very closed and we don't trust, rightfully so.
I'm a bit more skeptical of this society, and I would say they don't want to release or collect that data because it will show clearly where resources need to be spent and directed at, and those will be needed to be going to Black organizations and Black-led organizations, because it corresponds to me with some information that's just come out about research figures for race and police stopping and so on. And they don't want to release those figures because they know where the criticisms will come and the attacks. So I always think there's an ulterior motive behind these things, either but not collecting the data or but not releasing it, and so on. So Yeah.
But that's true as well, Luke. And also, we have to look at how people identify. Who is Black? Who is Black Caribbean? What, how are they even listed? Because remember, none of these stats or none of this collection is for us. It doesn't fit us. This system was never created for us. So it's, we're a triangle and they've got a box. So we know that that's why we talk about systemic and institutional racism, because it all does go back to racism. It goes back to that mindset that exists that just doesn't support us as a community. But what can we do differently? Because we know this. Martin Luther King knew this, Malcolm X knew this, Marcus Garvey knew this, and on and on and on. So what do we do differently? How can we change that narrative? And that, for me, is the key question, along with many others.
I saw a question there from Jean Tate, asking about how we see mental and emotional abuse, and I think it's a great question to be asking, because often some men use emotional and mental abuse rather than physical abuse, because one is it wasn't illegal, and although they've changed the law now to include in the description or definition of domestic violence that emotional abuse be included. Now, emotional abuse can take all kinds of forms, and mental abuse in many ways. I saw one of the clippings I have is of a father putting a rabbit in the oven and cooking it because he wanted to be spiteful to his partner and child, and sometimes they take it out on pets, on things that they like or admire, either breaking them or mistreating them, and that's a kind of emotional abuse. Also, deliberately undermining, a person by either, picking on some aspect of them to keep attacking it and highlighting it. It might be fat shaming, slim shaming, or age, or whatever it is they use. All of these can be used in terms of trying to make people feel less about themselves. So any kind of treatment that makes a person, in this case, woman, and makes a woman feel less than how she wants to feel, for me, is kind of emotional abuse. In my definition, and I noticed the real data that I included I also included economic abuse, because also men withhold money, take away money, control money, and all that kind of stuff that can become part of an abusive relationship. So yeah, it covers that full range. But I think, maybe Nicole, you might want to add to that.
And that was sorry, I'm getting some feedback. And that was the question around how to stop emotional abuse.
And about emotional and how you interpret it. I don't have it on my screen at the moment. But
yeah, I was trying to look, because we've got lots coming in. Sorry.
Hold on. Let me see.
Yeah, I think it's been slightly very
yeah, it's about commenting on it. It's about commenting on it. Emotional or defining it.
Yeah, there was a question to me and you. I remember seeing it. Sorry, I'm just looking back.
It was from Jean Tate. Would both Nicole and Luke give their perception of emotional and mental abuse and their devastating impact on Black women?
Okay.
Yeah, and I think you've got the emotional abuse from both sides, externally and internally. And especially when we, as you just said, Luke, we've got the whole economic and the color of classism, but then we also have colorism, don't we, in our community? And these things perpetuate into the community outside. So to me, when it comes to emotional, it's just as harmful. And I think we do need to talk about that as well. You're absolutely right. We need to talk about the devastating effects of anything that is going to shrink a person, that is going to make a person feel less than they are. And we've had this throughout our history. So yeah, I think we do need to talk more around emotional abuse and mental abuse. And we also need to talk a lot around mental health, because even in organizations now, everything's well-being, but they don't talk about the racial trauma. They don't, and that's why I mentioned that in the slides, that racial trauma is a thing. It's actually real. It's happening. And then if you couple it with all the things that we've said today, that, you know, we talk about intersectionalities, but when we talk about that level of double and triple and quadruple trauma, there's a lot there. So we need to dismantle all of that. So yeah, I mean, my view is that it's just as powerful. I wouldn't, you know, it's just as powerful, but it's almost like visible disabilities and invisible disabilities. And I'm not minimizing any experiences, but it's just to have that kind of understanding that just because someone's got a disability that's not visible, it doesn't mean that they're better off or more, you know, capable than someone else. It's around that emotional and mental is serious. And we know the statistics of our Black men as well, and Black people in mental institutions, and we're always being dosed up, we're always being like just discarded. The system is just destroying us left, right, and center.
Okay, there's another question there I wanted to look at from that is saying, they wondered about the criteria that was used to determine if a man is a good candidate for the program. And I expect that's about counseling perpetrators. That question was about. We decided, you know, we would see anyone that approached us. We didn't decide that, you know, somebody wasn't suitable. I know some projects actually boasted about turning away men, especially if they didn't come at the first session and accept complete responsibility for the actions. You know, for me, my criticism of that approach is that, you know, if somebody presents themselves and comes for help and they're not ready to accept responsibility, it's the counselor's role to get them to the point where they can see that it's, you know, that it is their responsibility. And that might take a session or two to do, but it needs to happen. But you don't turn away a man because he comes and he says, but oh, it's our fault. And I do feel that any man can be helped if he gets the right counseling and the right support. It depends on the program they're running and what they're doing. I've worked, you know, and I sometimes mention, you know, one of the hardest case I worked with, and this is a man who came from prison. He'd spent half of his lifetime in prison. At the point that he came to see me, he had killed another man. He'd been in prison for, charges of violent behavior, armed robbery, the full works. You know, couldn't find a more violent man, you know, fingers missing and all kinds of stuff from fights he'd been in. And after I'd counseled and worked with him for a year, and a little bit over a year, you know, he'd completely changed. Life is completely different. He's married, he's settled, never been back in prison, and a completely different life. And this is only one. You know, I used to actually boast of being able to, that the percentage of men that change, you know, would be in the 90s, you know, in terms of the men that I was in touch with and know. But, you know, we needed research. We didn't have finance, we didn't have the money, we didn't have the resources to do proper research. You know, doing immediate research is one thing. How do you do long-term research? Running 20, 30 years. You know, this guy, I know him now for 20 years and he's still changed. I know he's a different man. I count him as a friend now. So I feel that, you know, men can change. You know, men do change, because one of the criticisms you know, the attacks when I used to get it was, you know, leopards don't change, there's spots and so on, you know, and that's completely the wrong way to go about it. I wouldn't be in this job, or, you know, I wouldn't have been in that job if I felt that I was wasting my time, that men couldn't change. I don't believe there's so much genetic factors, that there's something inbuilt in men, but that it's society, the experiences they go through, and that if you work at them in the right way, you can actually get them to change completely. I would not, you know, I think only if somebody's born a psychopath or has had brain damage that you can't reach them. But any man can be helped and changed.
Thank you, Luke.
Can I make a suggestion, Omar? Rather than me acting as an intermediary for questions, there are new questions coming on the screen, including a very interesting one from Jackie. Would people want to read out their questions? I don't know if you'd want to invite Jackie to read out a
We've got a hand up as well.
Yeah,
yes, if you could put your hand up. Yeah, sorry.
No, absolutely. Well said. Just for the sake of time, so we obviously have a very few precious minutes remaining, but basically we've got time for Jackie McKenzie, the great Jackie McKenzie, if you'd like to ask your question, and then we can go to Dr. Liz Okokan, who has her hand up. Please do fire away.
Hi, everybody. I was happy for you to read it out, but I was just wondering how this debate ought to be framed around more general issues around poverty and capitalism, because I've seen many cases of women remaining in very violent households or where there are triggers. So you know down the road, I've even seen it within my own family, that you know down the road there's going to be a problem. But I think for the majority of women, it's harder to leave. I don't doubt that this isn't true for white women, but I think very often family structures and economic power, the lack of disparities in the economies mean that it's easier for them to move or to find a safe place. I think it's much less so for Black women in particular. And I just wondered what the two speakers who have been wonderful, and Nicole, sorry for spelling your name wrong in the chat, who have both been wonderful and have made me think quite a lot about what you've said and what we can all do, but also the issues particularly that Luke's raised around how men can be challenged and dealt with is one thing, but I think I'm quite concerned too about how realistic is it to, for women to really have alternatives. I know there are a whole range of organizations. There's such a lack of resources in terms of refuges and places. The cuts and so on have decimated that industry, or that sector rather. But even when those resources are there, I've seen people find it very difficult to move on. We're still in a situation really where men have economic power and hold the purse strings. And I think that has to factor in somehow, and I'm not quite sure how, without it becoming political or without you taking your eye off your main thing. I can see what your main thing is, but I'm just wondering how we posit several things together.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. And even going back to the main thing, there's so many layers, isn't there? And it's almost like some things can't work without the other. They have to work hand in hand together. And I think you're absolutely right when you talk about the economical factors. So we are looking at obviously the gender pay gap, but we know predominantly when we were talking about the gender pay gap, we're talking about white women. So I'm sorry to have to keep taking it back to race, but organizations can't publish an accurate gender pay gap if you haven't looked at the ethnicity pay gap, because we also know that people of color are paid less. So when we talk about, yes, economics, we have to be looking at how do we support that? What can we do around that? But I still think also we have to be looking at race, which you didn't discount, by the way. But I agree, there's I don't know if there's main things. I think there's just layers, and that we can't discount anything from the others. We have to look at what goes hand in hand, but there's so much there. Jackie, as you just mentioned, there's so much different avenues. Where do we attack it from and what do we do? But yeah, I think all of that has to be taken into account. And it can't just be just a man's view, of course not. But what can women do to be independent? What can they do to come out of those situations? What support really available to get them out into that safe space and be able to live their life?
Yeah, I agree with you in many ways. The safe places are definitely needed. We need a government to be putting resources into doing that. But of course, government choose what their priorities are. And if you got a government that is more concerned about making profits and looking after people, you will never get a system that will meet the needs, the real needs of the people. And poverty, as Jackie's, rightly saying, is a big issue in this. We know, more poor men will use violence more than men who are more wealthy. But it might not just be a poor or wealth factor, it could well be education as well, because one of the other things that is very clear in some of the research is that education makes a difference. If men get the education and the awareness, they can change their behavior. And so those are crucial factors. If people are living in cramped condition with social issues around just resources, likely to be more strained relationships, anger coming up, and all kinds of stuff. So, yeah, we need to consider all of those factors. I really feel that, the capitalist system is not set up to deal with this issue well. And that's why I've said, 40 years ago, the UN declared 1 in 3 women were likely to suffer abuse. It is still 1 in 3 women at this 40 years on, although billions have been spent trying to fix the problem, because the focus has been on looking at providing refuge and taking a woman away from the violent situation rather than fixing the problem. The problem is male violence and it's sexism, it's inequality, and these things, this kind of socialization for violence that almost every government depends on, the reliance on the criminal justice system and the jails and private jails. We got to fill those jails. You know, men don't commit crimes. You know, they're not going to fill those jails. The system is built in that way. And those prisons are not helping men because they're going there, they get worse. So we need a complete restructuring or reorganization of where society is and how they views people. And I doubt whether that can be achieved under a capitalist system, is why in some ways I feel I've given up on work in this country. I will work in countries which are more looking at alternative ways of dealing with people, where they will put people before profits.
Thank you very much, Luke and Nicole, for providing such detailed answers, and Jackie also for a very, very poignant point that you put forth there. Just for the sake of time, we will shortly start wrapping up, but I noticed that Dr. Liz Okokan did have her hand up. If you would like to ask your question,
we must hear from Dr. Liz, yes.
Yeah, please do.
Thank you so much, Luke and Nicole and Omar. I just want to say from everybody, thank you also for keeping an eye on the chat and the questions. And you've done a brilliant job, but our presenters have been really delicate and very careful in the way that they've presented a very difficult question. Sorry, my camera's not on, but I just wanted to reiterate and to support what Luke said there about rehabilitation and pointing out and pointing to something that Jackie said as well. I do feel that in our Black community, we've had a history of, you know, no snitching, keeping things quiet, keeping things a secret in our community. That doesn't help anybody's mental well-being. Last night, after I finished our lovely day together with Darker's House history, I watched Secrets and Lies, and Secrets and Lies are the things that do make all kinds of mental ill health worse. And I'm just so pleased that we've got somebody like Luke, who's very sensitive and very caring and has been in our community to help our men. And just to say that my mum, my house was like a women's refuge, as lots of things we do in our community aren't funded, are voluntary, are community-led, where the need is. Many women came to our house who'd been either beaten or thrown out, or when they were pregnant, not being supported by the NHS, I have to say, if they were nurses, etc. But one of the tragedies of my growing up was whenever we saw violence, and we often saw it, we were often witnesses of it ourselves, was when men were disempowered. And that is part of the financial and the racism. It's not just about poverty. My father, when he was a doctor, facing the racism that I've now faced in the NHS, would come home and be extremely angry. I'm not saying anything more about my background besides that, but just to say that it's not like with COVID deaths, etc. It's not about education or income. It's also about racism. It's a separate issue when you're faced with the racial trauma of working with people who disrespect your ability and mistrust you and denigrate you. But to just say that one of the aunties that we often had to support, when she passed away, sadly, very young really, her husband came to the funeral, hadn't seen the family for years, and he cried and wept, and he apologized to her for all the abuse that he'd leveled on her. I know it's too late, but there was recognition as we get on, and we don't want to have that when it's too late. As a community, we need to address these things now. All the multi-generational impacts of slavery and on our young people is coming out in so many different ways. And if we can support our young people in any way going through the next phase. We've got to continue to do what we can, and I'm really impressed and pleased that we have the community that we have here that is working together. Nicole, you're just such a wonderful mother. I can't believe you're a grandmother to be participating in the way you have. And I thank you for what you said about carnival, etc. as well, because I've felt a bit guilty about that. Let's be proud of where we are and let damn to everybody else how they feel. You know, I'm happy to walk Notting Hill streets the way I used to dress. I don't dress like that now, but there have been pictures of me found with firemen and police. But anyway, let's not go. But it's been used to trope. It's been used to trope young Black women, and that isn't good. And they haven't got my strength to say this isn't acceptable. But like I said, that, you know, I'm pleased that my daughter's now found a way of re-educating not just the students, but also the other teachers who dismiss our behaviour as wayward or lawless. It's because we have, you know, when we came out of COVID, all the young people had garden parties. You thought, oh, how disrespectful, how they needed to get together. They needed to be in each other's yards. They needed that as much as the rich people needed to go to Henley and Ascot. They didn't get put in jail for that, and they didn't get the fines that we had. So it's got to be seen in our context. But one of the things that I do feel disturbed about is the way that mixed race, mixed heritage young women are being treated even worse, and your data seems to show that as well. And for me, the worst thing was the way that when you defend somebody when you see something happen that's wrong and you defend something, that the woman that's defending you is being attacked. You know, I mean, I've seen that so many times at these young people's parties, that you're messing it up for me. This is my man and me's business. You know, if he hits me, that's between me and him. No, it's not. It's all of our responsibilities, because other people will see that and think it's an example to follow. But we've got a lot of work still to do. And like Dennett said, the prisons are happy to have us because they just want to fill up their yard with us. All they want is cheap labour, and we must do what we can to keep our young men away from that violence, and that violence that they perpetrate against each other, they are now perpetrating against their girlfriends and wives, etc. We can't have that repeating itself. So thank you very much.
Thank you,
So
Liz.
much
Thank you so much.
So much organising there, and thank you so much. I'll do whatever I can to support you all.
Thank you very much, Dr. Cook.
Emma, you're a star. Thank you. So great.
No. It's literally, it's nothing. It's literally, it was such an important discussion for us to have for our community, and it's a complete team effort. This would not have been possible without the help of everybody involved: Nicole, Luke, Dennett, and the whole CLS community organization. We basically need to have better outcomes provided for our community. Relating to violence against women and girls, you know, reducing economic disparities, and basically fighting for the changes that we deserve. You know, the Black Lives Matter movement has been imperative in bringing a lot of our grievances to the surface, but it must be noted that they've actually existed since 2014. And let's face it, everything that we've all been through historically, especially from within the Black community, goes way beyond BLM. It goes back 400 years and counting. So essentially, we deserve better outcomes for our women, for our men, for our children. And essentially, I'd just like to close with a very big thank you to everybody who's attended today. Thank you very much, Nicole. Without you, this would not have been possible. Luke, equally, thank you very much. Without your expertise, this would not have been possible in terms of having more experience of, you know, having worked with perpetrators and, you know, the wealth of experience that you bring to the table. Dennett, thank you so much for co-hosting with me. We had a very quick phone call about, you know, the logistics of how we'd kind of host it. And we just wanted to basically have a community discussion on an issue that's very much underreported. Just as a closing comment, we are completely aware that current policy does not afford much protection for Black women who are survivors or victims of domestic, sexual, and other forms of violence. As such, along with measures such as Valerie's Law being implemented, which was put forth by Sister Space. So Sister Space put together a petition that's been signed by over 100,000 individuals within the UK to provide better training for agencies who deal with domestic violence and more specifically survivors of domestic violence from within the Black community. They've put together this fantastic petition called to provide better training for agencies who work with Black victims of or survivors of domestic violence. In wanting to root out violence against women and girls in our community, we also feel that it's important that perpetrators are provided with resources to stop their violent or abusive ways for good. As such, we have obviously provided details of services that support both, most importantly, the survivors of domestic and sexual violence, but also we want to open the door for the conversation to be had with perpetrators so that we don't keep going through this repeat cycle of violence, which needs to be ended. And we all can do our part to help in stamping this out, or to use a better term, in ending violence against women and girls. And essentially, we deserve much better outcomes. So in closing, I'd just like to thank everybody for attending. Huge thank you to our guest speaker and CLS President Luke Daniels. Thank you very much, Nicole. And thank you for everybody's contributions today. We greatly appreciate it. I'm just going to stop recording.
And thank you for chairing.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Take care.
Thank you.